I want to talk about this op-ed that was published in the New York Times on Monday as I'm sitting here recording this. The headline has gotten a lot of attention on social media. The headline of this op-ed from the New York Times, the paper of record, is Trump Can Win on Character. This piece is written by Rich Lowry, and as I said, it's gotten a lot of attention for the headline, and a lot of the responses to it that I've seen on Twitter and other places, they're just responding to the headline. And the headline is ridiculous. The suggestion that in a head-to-head contest between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, that somehow Trump can win on the basis of character is absurd. Only a dyed-in-the-wool Trump cultist would even entertain such a ludicrous thought. But when you actually read the article, you find that it's even worse than that. First of all, and I assume that this is the result of, the typical thing that happens where someone writes the article, but someone else writes the headline, and the headline is crafted for maximum attention. Nowadays, we call it clickbait, but it's just, you see the headline and you got to read the article. And the headline doesn't necessarily reflect the contents of the article. It kind of does, but then again, it doesn't. So here's what Rich Lowry actually says in this piece in terms of Trump and character and how he can win the race on character. Quote, "Presidential races are won and lost on character as much on the issues, and often the issues are proxies for character. Not character in the sense of a candidate's personal life, but the attributes that play into the question of whether someone is suited to the presidency. Is he or she qualified, trustworthy, and strong? Does he or she care about average Americans?" And then Lowry runs through several examples from past elections of Democrats running on character in this sense. He says, quote, "The Obama team hammered Mitt Romney on the issues in 2012, but pretty much every policy argument went back to the core contention that he was a heartless, out-of-touch capitalist who valued the bottom line more than people. That ended up being the winning argument of the campaign." And then he gets into his advice for Donald Trump in his campaign against Vice President Kamala Harris. "Everything has to be connected to the deeper case that Ms. Harris is weak and a phony and doesn't truly care about the country or the middle class." Now, if I were to ask you to guess which candidate in the 2024 United States presidential election I am describing, and I describe that mystery unnamed candidate as, quote, "weak and a phony and doesn't truly care about the country or the middle class," between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, who would you guess I was describing? Does that sound like Kamala Harris? Again, to anyone who isn't a full-on committed member of the Donald Trump cult, to anyone in the outside world, to anyone with a modicum of reason, does that sound more like Donald Trump or more like Kamala Harris? Weak and phony and doesn't really care about the middle class. Now, you can believe whatever you want about Kamala Harris. You can believe that she is as phony of a politician as anybody else. And that when she comes out and gives her stump speeches and talks about building out the economy from the middle out and the bottom up instead of the top down, which is, something that President Biden used to say all the time as well. And she gives her economic speech and talks about empowering the people and empowering the working class. You can believe that she doesn't really mean that or she doesn't really care. But if we're going to compare her to Donald Trump, of those two candidates, which one is more phony? Which one comes to your mind first when I say, okay, one of them is phony? Is it Harris or is it Trump? I think for most people outside the Trump bubble, it's going to be Donald Trump. Trump is the phony. Trump is also the weak one because Trump is the one who can't ever stop complaining about how unfair everybody is to him. All he does is whine and piss and moan about how mean people are to him, about how disrespectful people are to him, about how he's not sure if he wants to have a presidential debate on ABC that he already agreed to because people on ABC are mean to him and people on ABC aren't fair to him, right? That's the weak one, not Kamala Harris. Even if you don't have as positive an opinion of Kamala Harris as I do. between the two of them, she's not the weak one, is she? She's not the phony, is she? She's not the one who seems to not really care about the middle class or the working class in this country, is she? The most upsetting thing, the most angering thing to me about this piece by Rich Lowry in the New York Times is if you read the whole thing, and I'm not going to read the entire thing to you, but if you read the entire thing, and it's not super long, it's basically just free advice to the Trump campaign. And I realize it's the op-ed page. I realize it is not, strictly speaking, journalism. It's not supposed to be straight news, just the facts. I get that. It's an op-ed. It's personal opinion. It's going to have a slant one way or the other. My objection to it is not that it's right-leaning. My objection to it is not that it's pro-Trump, although I do have an objection, just morally speaking, to anything that's pro-Trump, but that's not the reason I object to it being in the paper. Specifically, the New York Times, supposedly the newspaper, although I think we all know by now that that ship has sailed. My problem with it is that it is unsolicited advice to the Trump campaign. There's no thesis here. There's no argument here. There's just free advice to the Trump campaign from Rich Lowry. And my thesis is that if Rich Lowry feels like he has something to contribute to the Trump campaign, if he has an angle that he thinks Trump should run on against Harris and try to paint her as a phony and paint her as someone who doesn't care about the middle class and try to tie his policy attacks, to the extent that Trump ever even bothers making policy attacks, tries to tie his policy attacks into some characterization of her as a certain kind of person, if that's Rich Lowry's advice to the Donald Trump campaign and to Trump the candidate, okay, write the motherfucker an email. Call him on the phone. Why is this in the New York Times? Rich Lowry has his own magazine. Rich Lowry is the editor-in-chief of the National Review, one of the most famous, most widely circulated right-wing rags in the country. The National Review has been the magazine of record for the conservative movement for decades and decades and decades and decades. I wouldn't wipe my ass with it, but it's there, and a lot of people read it. And Rich Lowry is the editor-in-chief of it. And if he has free advice for the Trump campaign that he also wants to make public instead of just giving it directly to Donald Trump, he can publish it in his own fucking magazine. Why is this in the New York Times, even on the op-ed page? There is no public value to this at all. This is just campaigning for Trump. For free. Probably not for free, actually, because I bet they paid him for that. I bet the New York Times paid him to write that. So he's getting paid by the New York Times to publish his campaign advice to Donald Trump on the op-ed page. And here's the incredible thing to me and the disappointing thing. The opinion editor of the New York Times is a woman named Kathleen Kingsbury. Kathleen Kingsbury, before she worked for the New York Times, was a writer and editor for the Boston Globe. And in 2015, Kathleen Kingsbury won the Pulitzer Prize. You know what she won the Pulitzer Prize for? She won the Pulitzer Prize for a series of editorials that she wrote, shining a light on the plight of restaurant workers and how underpaid they were and how exploited they were and how they were forced to work in bad conditions at the various restaurants where they worked. It was proletariat. It was populist. It was righteous. It was, this is an injustice among the working people in this country, and you should know about it. You, the public, should know about it. It was worthwhile. It was valuable. It was important. And she was awarded the highest award in her field for that, and it was deserved. Good for her. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 2015, and now, less than 10 years later, she has theoretically ascended. Now she's the opinion page editor of the New York Times. And what is she printing on the opinion page of the New York Times? This bullshit, this completely undisguised campaign pamphlet, this strategy guide for Donald Trump on the opinion page of the New York Times that does no good for anybody, that offers no useful, helpful insight to anybody other than Donald Trump. And there it is for free on the opinion page of the New York Times, not only for Donald Trump to read, but for the millions of readers of the New York Times to read as well. What is the fucking point of this? What are we trying to accomplish? And I fear what the answer to that question might be from the Kathleen Kingsburys of the world. What are you trying to accomplish? And actually, you know what? Don't answer that, because I have a better question. And it's a question I find myself asking a lot lately when I read or watch or listen to supposed political journalism surrounding this presidential election, especially from people who are allegedly covering Donald Trump or trying to report on Donald Trump or let the people know about what Donald Trump is doing. I find myself asking this question over and over and over again, and I would love to get an answer to this. And here's the question. Could you people please do your fucking jobs? I'm not saying you need to carry water for Kamala Harris. I'm saying maybe just stop carrying so much water for Donald Trump. I'm not saying you need to publish free campaign literature for the Harris campaign. Just don't print it for fucking Donald Trump. You're constantly jacking yourselves off with this principle that you completely fail to uphold of how we're journalists. We're going to call it right down the middle. We're not going to favor one side or the other. We're going to be fair. We're going to be factual. We're going to stick to the truth. Okay. Could you start doing that sometime before November 5th? Could you do that? And I'm not saying everybody, not all political journalists are like this, but it is incredibly frustrating to see an article making the rounds on social media from the op-ed page of the New York motherfucking Times. And there is so little substance to it. It is nothing but free advice for Donald Trump, the presidential candidate, from a guy who has his own fucking magazine and he can print shit like that in his magazine whenever he wants. He doesn't need help, Kathleen Kingsbury, or anybody else at the New York Times who was involved in the decision to print this shit. Donald Trump doesn't need your help. Democracy needs your help. The United States needs your help. And the best thing you can do in your role as the fourth estate, in your role as journalists, to help democracy, to help the United States, is to actually do the job you claim you want to do and report factually and accurately on Donald Trump, as well as Kamala Harris. Do that. Stop treating it like a fucking horse race. Stop treating it like a fucking wrestling match. Have some sense of what is at stake, and maybe think twice, or if necessary, 3 or 4 times before you print bullshit like this by Rich Lowry in the goddamn New York Times again. How about that? Can you do that? Can you do us all a favor and do that? Thanks a lot. That would be great. We really appreciate it.